for another infectious disease Puscast covering the last 2 weeks of August 2016. References, as always, are available over at edgydoc.com, the home of my growing multimedia empire of books, blogs, podcasts, and apps. Oh my. I think this will be a short one, relatively speaking. I didn't find a lot of articles of interest, but I have a habit of bloviating, so maybe I can stretch this out to 3 or 4 hours. But let's get on to the literature, shall we? We'll start with a little debunking, as it were. I thought it was common practice during the Middle Ages to lob your enemy's dead over the walls. The orcs certainly did it in Lord of the Rings. And catapulting plague victims into the besieged city, I thought, was one of the earliest forms of biologic warfare. This letter to the editor in Emerging Infectious Diseases from the National Defense University, which sounds legit to me, suggests that there is no credible evidence that the Russians catapulted bodies of plague victims into the Swedish-held city of Reval in 1710. The best you can say about the Russians is, quote, the army dumped corpses into a stream that flowed into Reval, but the evidence does not show that the dead were plague victims, nor does evidence exist that clarifies whether the intent was contamination of the water supply or disposal of the bodies. Original accounts provide no evidence to suggest the Russians hurled bodies into the city, much less plague-infected bodies, end of quote. But it makes such a good story. I know that some of our colleagues may not necessarily buy into this whole concept of germ theory, perhaps why hand hygiene is never optimal in most institutions. When we started foaming at Legacy, my hospital system, infection rates fell by half, even though we were only at 20% adherence with our compliance. And every year, as the hand hygiene rates went up, our infection rates fell. Of course, we did a lot of other interventions at the same time. This is a nice study that shows that, again, as hand hygiene rates went from 82% to 95.9% over a 2-year period, infection rates fell from a little over 6 to a little over 4 per 1,000 patient days. There's a direct correlation between how good you are at washing your hands and what your infection rates are in your hospital. They did use the covert observation by designated staff as a way to measure hand hygiene. I will argue yet again that covert observation of hand hygiene is profoundly unethical, that you are watching healthcare providers put patients at risk and nothing is done in real time. In our system, we have incorporated real-time interventions as part of our hand hygiene program, and we have 100% adherence because the 5 or 10% of people who forget to foam their hands are corrected in the moment, are considered near misses, and make our hand hygiene rates nearly 100%. But if you see someone failing hand hygiene, they need to be corrected in real time, and to do otherwise is just so unethical. But that's unethical seems to be the major way all hand hygiene programs are done. And also of note was a VA study that looked at the effects on other infections with the MRSA prevention protocol, and they found a decrease in gram-negative infections as well, probably because everybody's finally washing their damn hands like they're supposed to. This next one was reported in an abstract out of Medscape. It was a study that compared 2 doses of IV zanamivir, 300 and 600, versus standard oral oseltamivir in patients with influenza, and found that they were essentially the same. Slightly higher but not statistically significant mortality rate in the zanamivir group, slightly faster resolution of symptoms. Of course, if you're dead, your symptoms have resolved very quickly in the zanamivir group. The nice thing about zanamivir, though, is it is intravenous. And in truly sick patients, such as we get in the ICU who cannot take oral, and one always worries about the reliability of oral medications in very sick patients, we do have an IV therapy that is probably just as good as oseltamivir for influenza. I'm sure it will be used by the bucket load in our ECMO service. It comes in buckets, by the way, not in the standard plastic IV bags. The standard dosing being 1 bucket IV QD. I look forward to when the study gets from abstract to published form so we can look at it in a little bit more detail. When I was younger, and probably still today, people argue that art saves lives. They're usually referring to paintings and dance and music. But it's certainly true of antiretroviral therapy. Yet another study to show that the use of art is effective in decreasing the transmission of HIV. This looked at serodiscordant couples, one of whom got early antiretroviral therapy, the other had delayed antiretroviral therapy. And in the couples that got immediate antiretroviral therapy, there was a 93% decrease in HIV transmission. It's not 100%. There was still transmission from HIV-infected patient to their uninfected partner in those on antiretroviral therapy, but again, it was markedly less likely. Probably a combination of pre-exposure prophylaxis, art in the infected patient, and condoms would pretty much prevent HIV from being spread in a way that would allow perpetuation in the population. The HPV vaccine is targeted to women before they become sexually active and can acquire the illness. But what about an older population, in this case 25 to 65? What is their risk of HIV? This study looked at that question and found that if you had high-risk sexual behaviors, that about 2/3 of HPV infections were new acquisition, and about 1/3 of the HPV they discovered was redetection of old infections of high-risk HPV strains. So there is probably some benefit in giving the HPV vaccine to older sexually active women, but unfortunately the horse is probably already a little bit out of the barn, given that at least about a third have the infection already. So you would expect the effects of the vaccine to not be as robust as you would in a population that was naive to the virus. Although Zika is getting all the press, don't forget about dengue. First, there was the outbreak in Brownsville, Texas. And then in 2014, as reported in CDC, there was an outbreak in Yuma County, Arizona, which occurred from people traveling across the border to Sonora, Mexico, where there was another ongoing outbreak of dengue, and they brought it back. While it appears that all the cases were travel associated, they can't say for sure, and certainly Yuma County is primed for dengue. Yuma County has the same mosquitoes that Sonora does, so Yuma County is another place to worry about for dengue outbreaks. And given a choice, as a 59-year-old male, I'd take a case of Zika over a case of dengue any day. Just keep in mind there's a lot of infections that could be coming our way. Maybe if we built this wall between the United States and Mexico, we could keep all the mosquitoes out. And we could have the mosquitoes pay for it. A brilliant idea. And speaking of Zika, a study out of Brazil suggested about 6% of babies who are born to Zika-positive mothers will have hearing loss. I don't know about you, but I tend to think of listeria as an infection predominantly associated with unpasteurized dairy products. Wrong. This was an outbreak that was associated with packaged salads. And to quote the CDC, this is the first reported outbreak of listeriosis associated with leafy greens, an 8th reported outbreak of listeriosis associated with fresh produce in the United States. All occurred since 2008, unquote. They are uncertain at this point as to why listeria is associated with leafy greens and produce rather than the more classic animal-associated listeriosis. I always say that leafy greens is my dinner's dinner, and this is yet another reason why all food should be deep-fried. I spent yesterday at the Oregon State Fair where everything is deep-fried. They had deep-fried bacon-wrapped corn dogs, deep-fried Twinkies, and deep-fried Oreos. It was a cardiologist's dream come true. But it's nothing compared to the Minnesota State Fair. Good God, if you want to see horrible eating habits, go there. See people walking around with the bucket o' cookies, a bucket of chocolate chip cookies in one hand and a giant fried turkey leg in the other. It's a sight to behold. Endocarditis is sort of one of my bread and butter consultations. It didn't really occur to me before, but according to this, the incidence of endocarditis is going up in people who people who inject drugs, as they call it in this article. And the hospitalizations in young people for endocarditis just about doubled during the observation period of 2000 to 2013. As I think back upon it, that seems legit. I see a lot more injection drug users than I used to. And they found that the other subgroup that had an increased risk for developing endocarditis or being admitted with endocarditis were white females, which again, as I think about it, reflects upon my experience in treating these patients. One perhaps of the many and ongoing complications of the opiate addiction issue in the United States. Inflammation is good, sometimes. Anti-inflammation is bad, sometimes. There is an interesting association, and remember, association is not causality, between the use of NSAIDs and the subsequent development of necrotizing fasciitis due to group A strep. The last meta-analysis I saw suggested it weren't so. There's also a suggestion that patients who take NSAIDs and have pneumonia are more likely to develop empyema and lung abscess. And in the particular study I'm talking about now, the use of NSAIDs was associated with the subsequent development of a peritonsillar abscess, with larger abscesses and with the isolation of anaerobes. Sometimes it's good to be inflamed. It keeps the infection at bay, and perhaps NSAIDs tilt the balance in favor of the bacteria. On the other hand, maybe people with more severe disease had more pain, so they're more likely to take NSAIDs. Causality is suspect, but I find the associations to be moderately compelling. Some studies just strike me as, wrong. This was a retrospective study that looked at the efficacy of oral vancomycin as a preventative for C. difficile and found it was effective. It decreased the rates of C. diff from 26% to 4%. However, that's a great way to develop VRE and then probably subsequently vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus by way of gene jumping. The other problem with this test is they say another potential strength of our study was that testing for CDI was based on the highly sensitive PCR method, minimizing the likelihood of false negative cases. But 2 of 3 patients were eventually considered asymptomatic. The problem with this study is that the C. diff toxin is way too sensitive, and they should have done a toxin assay. Whether or not you should give patients prophylactic vancomycin for C. difficile strikes me as a bad idea. Hopefully the future in C. difficile prevention is going to be on taking poo pills, that's my bet, rather than prophylactic antibiotics, which will only have, if the history of medicine is consistent, short-term benefit for long-term resistance and toxicity. So, don't do it. There have been ongoing outbreaks of MDR bacillary diarrhea. There has been Campylobacter in men who have sex with men in Montreal, and shigellosis in men who have sex with men in the United States. But another risk for shigellosis is in Orthodox Jewish communities. And it is an interesting contrast where the outbreak in MSMs has been percolating along for 20 years. The focus is in Israel, and the organism has taken advantage of modern travel to cause identical outbreaks in the United States, Britain, France, and Belgium. And they note the rapidity with which this one strain has spread. And this reminds me of a totally inappropriate HIV-related joke that we used to tell back in the day, and reminds me how things have changed. And finally, if you're worried about outbreaks of diseases, there was an outbreak of multi-drug resistant salmonella in Washington that was related to pork in this case. It's Washington, and there's Washington, D.C. When you live in Portland, there's no Washington State. Everybody knows when you're talking about Washington, you're talking about the second-rate area to the north. Washington, D.C. is that place to the east. And as long as we're talking risk factors, obstructive sleep apnea in this PLOS One evaluation is associated with not only community-acquired pneumonia, but having more severe community-acquired pneumonia, which shouldn't surprise you when you listen to how those people gurgle and gasp in their sleep. Stuff has to be going down their airway. And the guidelines for treatment for hospital-acquired and ventilator-acquired pneumonias have just been updated and are available at the IDSA website. I think of note with this particular guidelines is you cannot find that you need to give anaerobic therapy or cover anaerobes for hospital and ventilator-associated pneumonias. It's not in the guidelines again. If I had a nickel for every time somebody treated an aspiration event, like an aspiration pneumonia, with anti-anaerobic therapy, which is absolutely, totally, 100% dumbass every time it's done, I could be retired to the south of France. Boy, that sounds nice. But you don't need to treat anaerobes for hospital and ventilator-associated pneumonias. And I know you're all going to do it when someone aspirates, and you got to stop it, because it's stupid. I have never heard of the Red Queen hypothesis. It is, quote, derived from a statement from the Red Queen made to Alice in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. This is, of course, from Wikipedia, in which her explanation for the nature of Looking Glass Land is, now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. In evolutionary context, the Red Queen hypothesis is that species have to run, as it were, metaphorically speaking, or evolve in order to stay in the same place or to remain extant. So how does that apply to bacteria? Well, in this particular evaluation of pneumococcus, they looked at the effect of pneumococcal vaccination on pneumococcus in populations, and they found evolution in action. All the kids got vaccinated with the 7 and 13 valent conjugated vaccine. Those strains disappeared. The remaining serotypes took advantage of this ecologic niche to cause more disease. They proliferated. Then, after a while, there was narrowing of the number of strains causing disease, as competition led to some strains of pneumococcus that were more fit than others, and a new evolutionary equilibrium was established. The understanding of ID is nothing if not the understanding of applied evolution. What we need really is an 82-valent conjugated vaccine against pneumococcus, although it would probably be the size of a 20cc syringe. Ouch. I also suspect that now this new equilibrium has been reached, that resistance to antibiotics in the current strains of pneumococcus will start slowly creeping up, as it was about 10-15 years ago, when we had a lot more resistant pneumococci than we do today, thanks to the vaccine. Because the vaccine not only covers the most common strains, the most common strains are those that are resistant, or were, and they also disappeared for a while. First time ever I've seen a paper actually reflect my mental state when I read some of these papers. This was called Carbapenem-resistant Enterobacter species in retail seafood imported from Southeast Asia to Canada. And they used a PCR to look for carbapenemase resistance genes and beta-lactamase conferring genes. And this particular primer is called the BLA. And so I will now quote, "We use single and multiplex PCR to screen isolates for the major carbapenemase conferring blah, 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 and beta-lactamase conferring blah, 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 blah genes." Every article should be like that. And really, if this was ever read as a podcast, they should use the trumpet from Charlie Brown to describe the gene sequences. Not that it isn't important that Enterobacter are harboring blah blah genes and are being transferred by way of seafood. That's important, but they really should have named the gene something different. The rule for guideline writers is to recommend that everything be done on every patient every time, and that drives me nuts. All patients with staph bacteremia probably don't need an echo. Do all patients with candidemia need an ophthalmologic exam? Now, this study suggests probably not. It's quite uncommon to get endophthalmitis and chorioretinitis. Out of 227 patients, 11 developed it, which is 4.8%. And 4 of these were not able to communicate. So the vast majority of people with fungemia don't get fungal endophthalmitis, and most of those who do can tell you about it. So who should get an ophthalmologic exam? Well, I think it would be reasonable to do it in people who, A, can't tell you if they have eyeball findings, the comatose ICU patient, for example, or people, obviously, who have symptoms. But the vast majority of patients with fungemia do not get eyeball involvement. They also suggest in the guidelines that they get treated longer if they do have eyeball involvement, although it's probably a self-limited disease if they just have fungus balls as opposed to vitriol or other infections. But like most guidelines, they take crappy evidence and make grand, expensive, and probably unnecessary recommendations. The proverbial mountain out of a molehill. Years ago, there was a David Letterman joke where he was talking about those commercials that say, lose weight without diet or exercise. And Dave Letterman said, I guess that leaves cancer and AIDS. And I suppose worms. This is a meta-analysis that looked at the effect of helminth infections on human beings. Quote, infection was associated with lower glucose levels, less insulin resistance, and a lower prevalence of the metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes. And if you had worms, you had a 50% less chance of having metabolic dysfunctions as compared to those who did not have worms. I don't think I want to take a mouthful of helminths to get rid of my extra poundage, but it is interesting. Large swaths of the world do have worms, and it has been associated with decreased risks for inflammatory bowel disease, for example. It also makes children smaller and stupider, so that's a downside. But maybe we should give all our obese patients a handful of helminths to eat. You can get worms on the internet to treat your inflammatory bowel disease. I suppose it's just a matter of time before this is offered by a naturopath for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Of course, now naturopaths spend their time diagnosing imaginary worms and treating those. I wonder how they'd feel about giving the real deal to people. And that's it. The end of the Puscast covering the last 2 weeks of August. Man, what month is this? Who am I? Who's the president? I'm getting senile. This podcast covered the last 2 weeks of August in the year 2016. References are available at edgydoc.com, where, as I mentioned earlier, you can find all the links to my growing multimedia empire. And of course, go to iTunes and write me glowing reviews. It's the least you can do. And always do the least you can do. Otherwise, as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I will continue to follow along with you. Thank you, in dictation, and goodbye.